This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. These days, one can hardly take a flight without facing pressure to enroll oneself in the Digi Yatra app, which is there in every airport, ubiquitous these days. And since last month, however, there has been a surge of complaints from passengers about this entire Digi Yatra thing. The main complaint is about security personnel and airport staff collecting their biometrics for the app using coercion and deception too. And according to travelers, CISF personnel posted at the entry gates often ask them to scan their boarding pass and capture their photos, and then they themselves provide consent on behalf of the passengers and enroll them in the Digiyatra app without even informing them. So, this element of coercion is especially surprising since the Ministry of Civil Aviation, when it unveiled the Digiyatra policy in 2018, had made it clear that it would be entirely voluntary. And digital rights experts have highlighted several other concerns about the Digiyatra app related to privacy, surveillance, exclusion, lack of transparency and accountability, and violation of the passengers' dignity and autonomy. The ministry, on its part, has been repeating that the only objective of the Digiyatra's biometrics-enabled digital processing of passengers is to usher in quote unquote paperless and seamless movement through various checkpoints at airports such as the entry gate, security check area, and boarding gate. In this episode of In Focus, we try and answer all these key questions around the Digiyatra app. Is it safe? Is it reliable? How do airports in other countries process passengers in a streamlined and relatively quick manner? And is this app really worth it or should it be withdrawn? Joining us today are Prateek Wagre, Executive Director, Internet Freedom Foundation, and Disha Verma, who is also with Internet Freedom Foundation as Associate Policy Counsel, and she looks at surveillance and governance related issues. And the Internet Freedom Foundation, or IFF as it's known, is a non-profit that has been active in the realm of digital rights and policy. Prateek, Disha, welcome to InFocus. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Sampath.
So to start with, I'll come to you, Disha, first. I was wondering if you can give us a quick historical overview. How did this Digiyatra app come about? When did it come about? What is it all about exactly? And what has been the experience in other countries, which have tried a similar kind of a technological tool to sort of bring about a faster processing of passengers at overcrowded airports?
Sure, I'll try to keep it quick, but there's a lot of history to cover here. To put it simply, Digiyatra is a biometric based airport service of flight boarding system, like you mentioned in your introduction, which is based on the premise that once you have registered ahead of the travel and scanned your face at the entry point of the airport, you can pretty much breeze through the airport process without showing your ID or your boarding pass again. That is the premise, and it is being currently deployed at around 14 airports in India. But it was introduced, many years ago to make airport processes quicker. But right after the COVID-19 pandemic restrictions were lifted, it was sort of repackaged to be this contactless boarding option that will also relieve post-pandemic congestion at airports. Traditionally, passengers were expected to download the Digiyatra app and register on it before their travel by linking their Aadhaar cards or their driver's license. But today, that requirement has pretty much gone out of the window with what airports are calling one-time sign-ups for Digiyatra, which can happen on the spot, say at the entry gate of the terminals. And the passengers only have to show their ID and get their face scanned, and they're on Digiyatra. So it's moved on from an app to sort of like a walk-in service. And recent news reports and surveys will tell you that passengers often don't even realize that they're signing up for Digiyatra. If you were to trace back to its origin story and address sort of an ongoing mystery about Digiyatra, whether it's public or private, well, it was launched as far back as June 2017 by the Ministry of Civil Aviation as an industry-led initiative. But it followed the life cycle of any law or policy development.
So, when you say industry-led initiative, do you mean the airline industry, or do you mean some segment of the tech industry? And if so, which segment?
This was the airline industry. They made requests, or apparently, this is what the press release says, that there was an appetite for such a scheme to be on, and the Ministry of Civil Aviation coordinated those efforts into this scheme. And I mean, it followed all the life cycle of a law policy development. So they did do a stakeholder consultation. They did do a public consultation, although we're not able to find that exact document which puts it out for public consultation. They made interministerial committees. That this all happened in 2017, but the common thread running between all of this was always posed as a state facilitated service that you can choose to avail. It was always voluntary, never mandatory. Now, if you look at Digi Yatra, it has pretty strong undercurrents of privatization, of being a private entity. And this is because in 2018, the Ministry of Civil Aviation made the decision of handing over the operations and the development of Digi Yatra and its data ecosystem to a special purpose vehicle, which is a private company which would be created for this very purpose. And this is where the Digiyatra Foundation comes in. So in 2019, Digiyatra Foundation was incorporated as a joint venture between 5 private airports.
So, this Digiyatra Foundation, is it like a profit-making company, or is it a philanthropic body? It calls itself a foundation.
Well, it's incorporated as a private company. So we're unable to find much information on this. They only have 2 pages on their website. Not much is out in the public domain for us to see. We know that the shareholding is split between 5 private airports and about 26% with the public authority, that is the Airports Authority of India.
So, 5 private airports, as in owned by which private entities?
So these are Delhi, Mumbai, Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Cochin airports. And all of that, I mean, to some extent, all of these have mixed shareholding, right? Some of these are owned by private entities, like Delhi has GMR, and some amount of that shareholding will lie in public authorities. So if we were to lift the corporate veil, there are many mixed patterns to be seen. But as it stands today, Digi Yatra Foundation is a private company.
Okay. You spoke about this one-time sign up, which is the current status of how this app expands from what it used to be earlier, when you said we had to download the app and then register and so on. And you also mentioned that this after this one-time sign up, which happens at the airport entry gates, people don't even know that they have signed up. So this app, if it is if it really is an app meant to facilitate passengers, I'm just wondering, if you normally, when you have an app which is supposed to help you, you have the app on your phone and then you operate it and it helps you and you seek its help. So how does this actually work? I mean, this is an app which is for you, but you don't even know it's not even, it doesn't even need to be there on your phone, and then you still benefit from it through this sign up. Like, how does that happen?
Those are very valid questions, and those are questions struggling to get answers to. Prateek, yes.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say the same thing, right? It's unclear now. There is suddenly this mention of or this term that's being used about one-time sign-ups, right? Which there doesn't seem to be any documentation around it. It's unclear what the purpose of it is, especially if they claim, okay, the data is deleted after 24 hours, which is, and let's take that at face value for now. But it's really not clear as to then why all this is happening, why you're if you're in, and as we saw, right, and even the Hindu sort of reported on it, where you had a number of people complaining about effectively being coerced or tricked into signing up. But it's really unclear why some of these choices are being made for what is supposed to be a voluntary system. Right now, the ministry's stand has always been that it's voluntary. We have, I think, dated sometime last year also a response on RTI where they said it's voluntary, and I think publicly the position has been that it's voluntary. But it's, again, as tends to be the case in India, the distinction sometimes between voluntary and something that's mandatory or coerced or strongly suggested is not very clear, right? And Digiyatra sort of now has been inhabiting that space. Of course, now with the recent loud public pushback, it appears that there's been some shift in terms of how they've been operating in certain airports. That is just, I think, some some anecdotal views that we've been getting, but it remains to be seen how long they continue operating in this way, or whether we will revert to a scenario where where people are being signed up, whether it's this one time thing or they're being made to sign up in other ways for this system without really being given much choice, right? There was this interesting survey that's come out by local circles, and I haven't gone through it in a lot of detail, but one thing that sort of one of the headline numbers that sort of stood out to me was the fact that about 30% of people are signing up for it without knowing about it, right? And that just it just seems extremely confusing, extremely strange why things are are being rolled out in the way that they are. I want to quickly go back to this discussion of private, public, etc. Right, and I think it's a very it's almost a philosophical question at this point, right? Because of the way Disha sort of laid out the airports that have ownership, but if you go within the ownership structure of some of those airports, there's a split between public and private, etc. Right, so now at the end of the day, whether it's completely a private entity or a not-for-profit entity, whatever form it may take, it may change along the way, right? The end goal is, or the end outcome for us and what we're concerned about is how accountable it is to people in various ways. And currently, whatever institutional design they're following is allowing them to evade accountability, and that's what we're concerned about.
Right. I mean, that little data point you mentioned, Pratik, is very interesting. 30% of the people didn't know that they were getting signed up. So it is voluntary, but perhaps unconscious at the same time, is what one can sort of infer from this phenomenon. And to get back to the second part of my question, Disha, about the experience in other countries. Do you want to comment on that? I mean, do they have like? My experience, other airports in other countries in the West, they do seem to be faster. Is it because of some version of Digi Yatra, or is it like what has been their experience?
Uh, sure, I can touch upon this. So, in terms of international use cases, we have been tracking facial recognition based passenger verification in the UK and the US to some extent. And the findings that we have with Digi Yatra also apply to a great degree in those use cases. So, for instance, in the US, Digi Yatra like services have been instituted in some airports, and they have attracted actually far more criticism, especially when you contextualize this with their already sort of dubious immigration control practices and the effect that facial recognition based surveillance may have on people of color, for instance. So those concerns are exacerbated in that context. It's like a surveillance context. And Electronic Frontier Foundation is an organization that has done some great work on this, and they've contended that their airport biometric system are pretty much direct tools for exclusionary surveillance and institutional discrimination.
So the US doesn't have it anymore. They've stopped facial recognition at airports.
I'm not sure if they've stopped it. Like the TSA, from my knowledge, does have a opt-in service where you can pay for a service and go for facial recognition based authentication just to make your process faster. But the scope of our investigation there was very limited as to the surveillance function creep of facial recognition systems. So we've only looked at that. And we've had a sort of zoomed out view of the UK systems where we haven't noted comments or discussions like these, but we've seen people come out and say that these FRD based systems or the facial recognition based systems really do not make much difference in terms of passenger experience or decongesting the terminal of an airport, and that actual bottlenecks and airport processes are physical and that the government can solve at much in much simpler ways at much physical levels. Yeah, so there's been pushback equally in these two jurisdictions. Yet in India, it's like Pratik underscored, the discussion is also
Right. I
skewed.
mean, from my experience, most people in India don't seem to have much of a problem with facial recognition technology per se. I mean, they don't seem to have a much of a problem with violations of their privacy rights either. But that's a different story. But as long as, of course, it is used responsibly and there is proper governance structure, there's a valid reason. So, is this a valid perspective to have in the context of an app such as Digiyatra, which promises to speed up queues at airports using facial recognition? Pratik, you want to sort of elaborate on this debate?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting debate, right? As you pointed out, there is there are questions about the extent to which facial recognition technology is a concern amongst people. I'll come back to that, but I want to pick on this point, where you ended the statement, right? And it promises to speed up queues at airports, right? And Digiyatra is something that I'm looking at with a lot of fascination, right? It's a good example of techno solutionism meeting technology theater, right? And I'll explain what I mean by that, but the takeaway is that it is my contention, and I think people are free to disagree with me on this, is that the way it's being rolled out right now, it's effectively inequitable allocation of resources that is cosplaying as efficiency, right? And let me sort of give an example of paint a little bit of a picture there, right? In the sense that, look, if you look at airport passengers rates growing, I think they've been growing 8 to 10% a year for the last couple of years, expected to grow at 15%. Now, a security point, whether it's at the entrance of the airport or whether it's the security verification inside, is always going to be a bottleneck. That is inevitable, right? Because you're always going to have significantly more number of people than the rate at which these queues can move, right? But now what they've done with the rollout of Digi Yatra is that the way they've allocated resources to Digiyatra has also been inequitable, right? Now it's varied in different proportions in different airports, so there isn't a fixed number, right? But for a lot of cases in the early days, at least, you had a situation where, let's say X number of gates were reserved, right, for Digiyatra, but the actual proportion of passengers that were using it was much lower than X, right? And as a result of that, those people were actually breathing through, and they were like, "Hey, great! This is an excellent, efficient service, right?" Resulting, leading to that impression, right? That then sort of creates this thing that, look, this is faster, then you have potentially more people signing on to it. As a result, that allocation is further skewed, right? And so now what you have is a scenario where people who don't use that service are constantly facing a degrading experience, right? Because the number of queues that are available to them is reducing, while the number of queues that are being set aside for Digiyatra is increasing, right? But again, at the end of the day, there is a bottleneck there. It is a security verification. It is going to slow things down, which is why I think you had a couple of weeks ago that there was this I forget whether it was a photo or a video that a lot of people are sharing on Twitter, right? And I believe it was Bangalore airport, of a very, very, very long Digiyatra queue, right? So as long, you're always going to have this problem, right? It's not going to solve the fact that, or it's not going to solve the situation where, you are essentially creating a bottleneck for security verification. But it just seems like, facial recognition is this nice, cool technology. You can sort of breeze through it faster, right? And I have a counter experiment for the airports in India, right? If any of them want to sort of take this up, just to illustrate the point of inequitable allocation of resources, right? If we were to say, for example, anyone wearing a green shirt you have 50% of the entry gates at an airport dedicated to someone wearing a green shirt, right? And I'm just picking green because I happen to be wearing green right now. What happens to them, right? Will they get through security faster? Very likely, because it's unlikely that 50% of all people entering the airport are wearing green. I know this is a slightly absurd example, but the point I'm making is that if you have a situation where you're misallocating resources.
So by allocating, when you say resources, you basically mean entry gates, Pratik?
It can be gates. Yes, it can be gates at the entrance to the airport. It can be gates at the security point, right? At the security checks in some cases.
Do you mean only these entry gates, or you mean something else as well?
At this level, I'm talking about that, right? But then the other question that also then comes up is that the experience for people who are not using it, right? Like I said, those gates are reducing. Now it remains to be seen over a period of time whether more burden will be added to those people, right? In the form of, do they have to justify why they are not opting out, why they're not opting for Digiyatra? And I'm taking a 4-5 year horizon, right? I'm not saying this will happen in the next 6 months, right? But when you're looking at when you're analyzing these sort of things, it's also important to project, right?
Yeah, this seems to have it's a very good example analogy you made of someone with a green shirt having a better. Maybe they should just discard Digi Yatra and start a green shirt app. Maybe that will loosen up the queues. I was just wondering if it has the stamp of this whole this nudge philosophy of behavior change or modification. The behaviorists used to say, just you call it mandatory, we call it voluntary, and then you keep nudging people by all these devious means of reducing the number of entry gates or making it so far off and so difficult to walk through that you might as well go to the nearest one, which has Digiyatra, and do this one-time sign up. Sorry, when you go on, I interrupted you.
No, no,
Yeah.
and no, and no, and that's a fair point, right? And I think, look, it's always going to be very hard to prove that, right? I think it's a real important aspect to consider, because you also have to look at the context of people at airports, right? People are normally in a hurry. They rarely have the time to either to argue with whether it's the staff at the airport or CISF personnel, or walk much longer or get into queues, or basically opt for processes that seem slow, right now, for various reasons. So you also have that, right, where you're essentially in a scenario where the person is likely to choose the path of least resistance, right? Look, and that's generally what people do in life, but more so in this context, right, where all you want to do is get into the airport, board your flight, and go wherever you have to go, right? So there is there is that aspect. Then you come back to the facial recognition aspect of it, right? Now, look, facial recognition technology, again, a lot has been written and studied about the accuracy aspect of it, and how that works. And again, in our investigation, or most of the use cases we come across facial recognition, there's always a tie-in with surveillance, right? Now you can do it in that purpose. You can also have facial recognition in the sort of an authentication purpose, like you would do on a phone, right? Now, it's in this case, the claim that they make is that your facial biometrics, facial information sort of remains on your phone, etc. Right? So again, let's take that at face value, right? Which is why I went back to that other question of resource allocation, while recognizing that I don't think you can completely decouple this from surveillance, despite whatever the claims are, because at the end of the day, it's an airport. There is always going to be an overwhelming security consideration of with these things. So you can't completely decouple the surveillance aspects, irrespective of what is said about how long that information is stored or not. And of course, there is contradiction there in terms of what the privacy policy says. So it's unclear, right? In some cases, it says it could be retained longer.
Pratik, sorry to interrupt, but what is the danger for the ordinary passenger from facial recognition technology? If everything is sort of there is a seeming justification for it, what should they be afraid of?
Look, so first, I disagree that there's a seeming justification, and secondly, the thing with that question is that it's extremely narrowly focused on just facial recognition technology, right? And I want to draw that context a little broader, just a little bit, which is that you're looking, we're living right now at a time where you're being quantified through various data points in different ways, right? At all points in time. Now, you are also then seeing how we constantly see reports about this data then being leaked or breached, or some form or the other, right? So it is a prudent choice for an individual actor to limit their exposure of information, whether it's biometric, whether demographic, whether it's transactional, whether it's commercial, whatever it is, to limit it to the extent that they can. Right now, an individual actor is never going to make a huge structural difference, but you still want to sort of be able to not be forced into these sort of scenarios, right? So it's very important to paint this into the broader picture of what's happening with our personal information, right? And how little control we have, and how much more do you want to add to that, right? And then there are questions of, look, how this information can be used, abused, misused, etc.
Right. I mean that's a very important point, Pratik. I appreciate you making that. I mean, this entire question of how little control we have over the amount of data that is taken from us, and and used in ways again over which we have no idea. And on this, actually, Disha, I wanted to come to you with a question. I mean, we were going through the reports, put out by the Internet Freedom Foundation, your report, and I was just struck by the fact that there seems to be no legal basis or framework for the operations of this app. I mean, there is a reference to a particular set of rules or whatever data privacy related stuff which did not exist when this thing came into being. So can you explain what exactly is the situation on this particular thing, this whole legal basis for the app, how it works, what is the framework?
Right, sure. Well, this will be a sort of deeper legal contemplation of the right to privacy, and whether it is justified or legitimate for a service like Digi Yatra to infringe upon passenger privacy in the manner that it does. So bear with me. We look at legal interpretation by courts specifically, and here I'm talking about the nine-bench Supreme Court judgment, which was K.S. Puttaswamy, and there they lay down certain test to answer this very question, like what is the level of legitimacy and whether it is justified. And it says that in order to limit or infringe upon someone's privacy, anyone's privacy, which is their constitutional right, the law or the policy or the tool or the service, which in this case will include Digiyatra, will need to meet certain thresholds, like three thresholds particularly, of legality, necessity, and proportionality. So, legality, which is the first prong, says that there must be a law in existence to justify an action of limiting or infringing someone's privacy. And this law needs to have a very clear procedure on how said privacy will be limited. Now, we see that the Digiyatra service has privacy implications which are very far and beyond, and they span many areas of concerns. Like they have privacy concerns, informational privacy is being implicated there, but they also have surveillance concerns. We do have the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, which came out in 2023, and the IT Act to cover, vaguely cover data protection as issues. But there is no law in India right now that provides procedural safeguards for surveillance risks and facial recognition technology, particularly. So, not even a standard operating procedure or any passenger centric.
Disha, procedural safeguards for surveillance risks. I mean, this is legal jargon for lay listeners. It will be like gobbledygook. Can you please like simplify it and tell us what exactly you mean by procedural safeguards for surveillance risk? Like, break it down.
I will make it completely non-legalese. So facial recognition technology is being used not just in Digiyatra but many other like aspects of life. You go out on a street and there will be CCTV cameras, right? They might be enabled with facial recognition tech, and you have many government schemes. And I'm only talking about government at this point, just to keep the conversation limited to that. There will be schemes wherein you come in to take your ration, for instance, and your face will be scanned. What happens to this data that is collected from your face, right? All the data points that are taken from here, stored in what kind of a database? How are they shared? What happens if if your right to privacy is injured, or if this data is breached, or what is the particular procedure to follow to implement a facial recognition technology and to do it safely? That procedure is completely missing, and the safeguards for people to approach the government in this case, or any other service provider in case of a data breach, those are particularly missing. So we're talking very in a silo of facial recognition technology, because it's such a different thing from, say, giving your email or your phone number to like an interface or like a service provider. This is your face being scanned, and the data points being processed are very different as well. So we don't have standard operating procedures. We don't have a central law to look at it and to make sure that citizens walk away like they walk away without their privacy being harmed, or their facial biometric data, which is incredibly valuable, being breached in any way. And so largely we see executive bodies like police using FRT based tools and creating databases out of it, but largely all of that happens without a legal backing to it, which is why we say that there is no legality. And we do have policies for Digiyatra. Coming back to this particular instance, we do have implementation plans back from 2018. We have a data policy inside the biometric based system scheme policy 2017, but those are merely documents which a citizen cannot tomorrow enforce against the entities that are providing the Digiyatra service, whether be it the ministry, whether be it the Digiyatra Foundation. And if you look at the Digiyatra Foundation, their own privacy policy is full of holes. It has many discrepancies and many weak safeguards or weak provisions that Pratik will cover later. But so what we have is not adequate, and what we have is not law. So what does an aggrieved person do in case of breaches in relation to Digiyatra, in case of any form of other harms? Which is why we say that Digiyatra lacks that legality and the legal basis.
I want to add two things very quickly. I won't take too much time. Right, one is just broader context again. A lot of the operation happened no data protection law. Now we have a data protection law, but it's unclear how functional it is because we are still waiting for the rules. But effectively, at this point, there isn't like a data protection functioning regime in a sense, right? Apart from what's there under 43A of the of the IT Act. The other point I want to, and I want to point out to a limitation of the legal basis argument that is often used, right? Because if you look at the current data protection law, the way it's worded almost is that it sort of legitimizes all processing of data as long as it is not explicitly prohibited, right? And I think that's extremely problematic. That's an extremely problematic provision to have in there in a law that's meant to protect your privacy, right? You're essentially saying that, look, unless some form of processing is explicitly banned, you can go ahead and do whatever you want, right? And I think that's a huge shortcoming in the current law, wherever it is functional in whatever form, whenever that happens. And I think it's important for us as advocates to realize the limitation of the legal basis argument, and for people to understand the way laws are being drafted currently.
Right. So just to let me flip it and put it this way. So is there a danger, let us say, what I understand from what you and Disha have been saying is that this facial recognition technology, the kind of data points it collects is it's fundamentally of a different kind. It's at a different level from what you share when you share your email ID or date of birth or whatever. Is there a possibility that in one particular area or a storehouse, after this FRT happens and Digi Yatra collects all your travel data and all that, is there a possibility that there is one place where your Aadhaar details and your face and your date of birth, email ID, phone number, house address, everything goes up in one place, and there is a breach from that place? Is that like a reasonable fear to have, or is it far-fetched, or is it not related to Digiyatra as such?
No, look, I think in general it's not an unreasonable fear to have. In this case, it is unclear whether that's an applicable fear directly, right, in the context of Digiyatra, because it's, there is some amount of data being aggregated, right? But the claim is that, okay, maybe facial recognition information is not in there, but if you're using the app, you are linking it to DigiLocker, etc., right? So it is sort of diffused in a sense, but you are creating multiple points where there is risk, right? And like I said, it's while there may not be like a single warehouse specifically in this context, right, data warehouse where all this is there, the risk of breach in terms of whether it's your travel information, etc., right, now whether that happens at an airport system, whether it happens at an airline system, there can be multiple points at which it happens, and the risk of breach still exists, right? And again, to be fair, that risk is always going to exist. It would be wrong for me to say that any system is completely or 100% 100% safe. Then the problem is, okay, what is the institutional design of the entity, and are they taking responsibility, or are you basically diffusing responsibility in such a way that ultimately no one is held accountable? Currently, we are more we're tending towards the latter scenario, right, where even if there is a breach, you're likely going to be pointed to different entities, each claiming that the breach didn't happen with them or it's not their fault. And then where do you get recourse?
Right. We are running out of time a little bit, Pratik. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to have both of you address a couple of other questions I had. One of which I was really concerned about was this potential for exclusion. And I was, I'll tell you where I'm coming from here, because one other context where we've had a similar kind of a phenomenon unrolling was this entire Aadhaar based authentication, which began as voluntary, became sort of nudge mandatory, and there's a lot of exclusion, especially in MJNR, EGA, PDS, and so many other contexts where it is Aadhaar based biometrics processing led to exclusion. So I was just wondering, what exactly are you guys thinking in terms of the potential for exclusion, where you have facial recognition being the kind of authenticating tool for entry into your travel?
So I was just going to say, look, one aspect of the inclusion, certain exclusion rather, is certainly the idea, or the possibility of an error being introduced, right, or the system failing, right. Now we are not yet at a point where they are not allowing you, if it doesn't fail, they just send you into another queue, right. So at this stage, exclusion at that level is not happening, right. But it could, depending on how this rollout sort of happen, right? Another potentially speculative aspect to consider is then how this plays into, look, the ability to deny someone access to an airport, right? Now, whether that can be maybe in the form of a no-fly list, right? But then you have to look into how people get added onto the list, what procedures are, and to be honest,
What if we imagine a scenario where Digiyatra reaches a point where Aadhaar has reached now? It's like ubiquitous, everybody is on it. There is no alternative. I mean, what happens then?
yeah, look, so when we're at that point, you also have to then recognize that Digiyatra is likely not limited just to airports, right? It is probably in train stations, other stations. I don't know if by then it may even expand to other private places, right? Now, in that case, the cost of failure, right? The cost of failure is basically not having access to any of these spaces, right? Affecting your right to free movement. The other potential of that, and people can disagree with me for being speculative on this, but as a digital rights advocate, I will make this point that look, it also then allows the ability for you to specifically deny access and target people and deny access to them, right? If you can say, I don't like Pratik Wagre, I don't want him flying, I don't want him going to a mall, I don't want him taking a train station, going to the train station and taking a train. You can exclude me from that, right? And if Digiyatra is your only way of getting in, then I have no other way to get in, right? And on this, I'll just make a fiction recommendation for your listeners, right? There's this very interesting dystopian movie called What Happened to Monday. Not a great movie overall, but I would still recommend watching it for the world they build in terms of how exclusion can happen through facial recognition systems.
Right, I've seen that film. Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah, it's a very good film as well. Disha, did you want to add to what Pratik had said on this particular question?
Yes, so Pratik's covered all bases, but just to talk about exclusion and not from a facial recognition standpoint, is just the digital exclusion that it exacerbates, right? In airports, we don't talk about it much because people of a certain, people who can afford to fly, don't have to face questions like these. But if this were to be rolled out at railway stations and other more ubiquitous spaces, we run the risk of excluding people who don't necessarily have smartphones or who don't own the facilities to onboard themselves. So that's a conversation that is currently missing. I mean, thankfully it's restricted to airports, but we can see ourselves having in the future.
Right. I mean, Digi Yatra, I mean, seems like the name seems to sort of spell or sort of indicate that it's not just one kind of yatra. Anyway, we'll have to wait and see if it moves to other forms of travel as well. And if it does, then one of the things which is going to be really important is what does a passenger do in case of what he or she feels is unfair denial of service, some kind of a grievance, or you miss a flight because app was not able to match your face with the ID in your database or something like that. So, and one of the things I found in your writings, Disha, was that you were saying that the nodal authorities for this entire service are not covered under the RTI, even though the entire thing was launched as a state facilitated thing. Like, how does that happen? How is that the case? How does it work like that?
Sure. Okay, so I will address this in two parts. First, let's talk about what a passenger can do, and second, let's talk about what citizens can do just to keep our public authorities accountable, right? Like, because we want to have transparency and we want to know what's going on. So, as a passenger, like you said, yes, you may face grievances. Well, we don't have statutory remedies specifically for Digiyatra, by which I mean there's no remedies or mechanisms written into any sort of law. But the Ministry of Civil Aviation has its Air Seva portal, which it launched in conjunction with Digi Yatra to take sort of general complaints from passengers. So that's one recourse to take. And then Digi Yatra Foundation itself has its own privacy policy, which says that in case you face any grievances, you can write an email to us. Now, I can say with authority what I'm about to say because I have done both. I was personally forced pretty much by the neck into signing up for Digi Yatra at the Delhi airport very recently. So I tried filing a complaint on Air Seva first, and it was quite incoherent and incomprehensive to navigate. It's a form with automated responses, so you don't have any drop down options for Digiyatra specifically, so it confines the scope of your complaint. It's also limited by character limits, so you can't really talk about exactly what happened to you. And we as IFF have also written to the Digiyatra Foundation via email as suggested, but we haven't really heard anything. So I'm not sure how robust these mechanisms are for an aggrieved passenger, which is definitely cause for worry. I will just touch upon very quickly what happens to citizens who are not necessarily passengers, but we still want to know what is going on within the system for Digiyatra and data sharing. We have a stellar tool, the Right to Information Act, which we can invoke and file RTI requests asking for such information. So, very pointedly, Digiyatra Foundation is not covered under the RTI Act simply because it's a private authority, and only public authorities are can be entitled or can be enforced to give information under the Act. Now, the auditing authority of Digiyatra Foundation is a public authority, which is the Computer Emergency Response Team, and this is an authority within the Ministry of IT. They must conduct cybersecurity vulnerability audits and reports pretty periodically and publish them. Now, two confusions and problems arise from this. One, they don't publish or they haven't yet published any reports on Digiyatra audits or the data ecosystem of vulnerability audits. And two, we can't really invoke the RTI Act to ask for them because the certain as a team, as an authority, was very recently exempted from the RTI Act very specifically. So in December 2023, we had a notification saying that certain will not be a part of the RTI Act, and under Section 24, if listeners would like some more context, as an intelligence and security agency, you can't really ask them for information. So now we're in a position where we don't have any transparency into this, and as passengers, we can't really be ensured that our grievances will be addressed.
Right. I mean, no transparency and not much by way of accountability either. Pratik, you want to add anything to Disha's comments on this question?
Not anything of value in this. It just a little flippant in the sense that they do have a Twitter handle, and that does seem to respond now. Whether that's the right way for an whether that's the only way you want an authority like this responding is another matter.
Okay. Thank you for reminding listeners that they do have a last recourse, which is Twitter or X, as they call it now. So it's fairly clear now. I think listening to both of you, I mean, you've explained it so well. Whether it's privacy or consent, surveillance, transparency. I mean, there are all these concerns which are very much there, and yet this app is sort of being pressured on people. It's sort of forced upon them. So let's assume all these concerns are by some kind of miracle or maybe through serious government work on this, citizens' voices. These concerns are addressed. Would it still be an effective tool, do you think? Is it worth all the trouble, so to speak, for speeding up passengers processing in airports? I think you want to go first, and maybe Disha can have the last word.
Yeah, no, I think I'll go back to the green shirt example, right? On that, in the sense that even if you magically solve all these other things, there is an allocation consideration here, and the fact that look, airport security or travel, any form of security in travel is by design a bottleneck, and you're not going to completely solve that with this, right? And the thing I will add though with this current model of Digi Yatra, I think it's something that listeners should be aware also is that this setup that institutional design that we were talking about is not unique to Digiyatra, and it's something we should focus on. If you look across the quote unquote digital public infrastructure, the suite that we have, whether it's ONDC, whether it's UPI, all of them follow this institutional design. Right now, we don't have the time to go into that because that's probably in a whole other episode by itself.
Sorry, Pratik. Very quickly, can you just explain what you mean by the institutional, the design? Just maybe 2-3 points, like what so the listeners get what the drift of what you're saying.
Very happy to do that. So I think we've covered multiple points in this, how the body that's or the foundation that's at the core of it is a sort of a joint venture of sorts between a number of private entities and a number of public entities, right? That's sort of consistent throughout, right? Whether you look at ONDC or whether you look at NPCI in the case of UPI, right? And what this setup does is, one, you're outside the ambit of the RTI Act, right? So as a citizen, you're unable to really get any information in terms of its deliberations, how it functions, etc. Right? You can't even file the RTI request. It discloses what it wants to. It may or may not want to disclose a lot of things. The other thing is that they are effectively functioning as quasi-regulators without the public accountability of a regulator, right? So they're able to take decisions. Sometimes this will be passed off as it enables them to be nimble, it enables them to be responsive, right? But it also enabling them to be unaccountable. And as a democracy, we need to be really concerned about that, right? Because you sort of have the design across multiple institutions that impact citizens' lives today.
Right. I mean, that's a very important point. I think the big picture is something we also need to keep in mind. The way these app-based, technology-based solutions are brought upon and imposed on a large number of people without adequate participation in the way these decisions are taken. And Disha, you want to add final thoughts on whether this is worth all the trouble? Can we look to some version or avatar of Digi Yatra which is very nice and kind to people?
Well, I can't add to what Pratik said. I think it's very eloquently put. But on your specific question, I mean, I'll leave listeners with think sort of a meme. It's funny enough to be called one. But I saw a picture on Twitter of the Digiyatra queue being so long and the normal queue having like two people. So how do we decongest Digiyatra now? Possibly a Digiyatra 2.0, 2.0. I mean, it's never ending, right? Like the issues that we're targeting to solve and we're aiming to solve through Digiyatra are not being solved and will not be solved. It's just adding layers and layers and layers of problems. So in my opinion, I don't think it's worth it.
Right. I mean, that's a fairly, I think, clear verdict there. I mean, we'll have to wait and see to what extent the people's concerns and their voicing of their concerns reaches the ears of the powers that be, and hopefully it will. And there will be some kind of course correction on this entire suite of harassments which people are having to face on account of this app. Thank you so much, Pratik. Thank you so much, Disha, for taking the time out and joining us and sharing your expert observations and insights on this topic. Thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.